Good morning. Welcome to the Bucket Courses, a great place to learn new and interesting things and meet new and interesting people. My name is Barb Leese. I'm very glad to see all of you. And here are some things you need to know before we start. Masks are welcome, but not required. Please silence your cell phones. Turn on your tea coil if you have one. If there's time for questions, Judy and I will come around with mics. Please speak directly into the mic. Coffee and cookies cost about $2 a person. If you're able, please consider putting a little money in the big green bucket. If you're able, please put your chair up after the program on the dollies. There's dollies at the front and the back of the room. And now for the main event. Shuchi Kapila is professor of English at Grinnell College. Her scholarly work focuses on 19th century England, 19th and 20th century British colonialism in South Asia, and literary and cultural production in post-colonial South Asia. She is currently working on a project on the memory of the Indian partition of 1947. Which created the two South Asian nations of India and Pakistan. She is interested in how memory travels and what kinds of cultural practices of memorialization are progressive and have been successful in South Asia. Please join me in welcoming Professor Shuchi Kapila.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, all right. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to share some thoughts and ideas, none of which have anything to do with what you just said, but but I hope will be somewhat interesting. Nevertheless, I just want to thank the committee, the Bucket Course Committee, and especially Judy and Janet and Carla for kind of organizing this. Thanks to Monique for her very, very timely assistance with tech. I learned a few things, such as how to embed, videos in your PowerPoint, which I've never been able to do before. So, yay, Monique! Just want to say that. I also want to say that 3 years ago, when I was here doing the first part of the Bucket Course, the world was a really different place. And there's something astonishing about standing here before you after what have been, sorry, just years of loss. I mean, globally, nationally, and personally. And so I'm grateful for this space to speak to you today, because it reminds me that things go on. And I have never broken down in public in the last 3 years, so it must be something about the company that you're, drawing out the deepest of my thoughts today. So with that, let me move to something quite different, though it does have also to do with loss. And what I thought I would talk to you about today is a new area of interest for me, which is climate change fiction, Anthropocene fiction, and I hope to offer a course on that. And it came out of my work on the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, and none of what I'm saying is necessarily new, but it is something that Ghosh, I think, puts really eloquently, and I feel like we should attend to what he says, and then, my point would be to see how writers are dealing with some of his thoughts. So, without any more preamble, to start, and then I also want to say that I know that, we have instructions that we shouldn't be reading too much, but my tool is text. And what I work on is fiction, which is a lot of text. So I'm going to try to read it out slowly, and some things will be on the PowerPoint, but this talk doesn't depend on your reading anything. So that should be fine. So climate change events now present to us a reality that was once the stuff of science fiction, whether you think of devastating tornadoes, uncontrollable wildfires, snow in Los Angeles, drought in the American Southwest, and last but not by any means least, rising floodwaters in the global South, which has been a cause of great concern in places like Pakistan and Bangladesh. So the future is here, and it's not a distant fantasy, but in fact, it's something we have to confront every day, as we did last evening, when suddenly, Grinnell has become Tornado Alley, which, I don't remember in my 20-odd years of living here, in such a short span of time, such severe weather. So given all this, I thought what I would do is talk to you about Ghosh's 2016 book called The Great Derangement, which is kind of an interesting title, and it'll explain itself as I go along. And then his books, The Great Derangement 2016, it's called Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And it's actually essays rather than a book of fiction. I'm going to talk a little bit about his book, The Hungry Tide, which was published in the early 2000s. His more recent novel called Gun Island, which some of you may have seen, where the question is Ghosh crazy? Is fiction going crazy? Is the world crazy? Are we readers crazy? I'm going to ask questions like that. And then finally, Ruth Ozeki, her novel, A Tale for the Time Being, also from the 2000s. So this is kind of the material that I want to talk to you about. So given the urgency of what I just pointed out for climate change, you might expect that novelists would be vying with one another to represent climate change in their fictional worlds. But according to Indian-American writer Amitav Ghosh, that has not been the case. And when I say fiction, I will explain in a little bit, I don't mean science fiction, speculative fiction, the kind of fantasy worlds. I mean in the realm of the novel as we know it, that depicts what we call realism, about which also I will have something to say. And I just want to read to you two passages from The Great Derangement where Ghosh is talking about his own experience. And part of what he wants to say is that this may not be something new, that is climate change. And what I like about Ghosh is he's informed by his experience of growing up in India, in the global South, by his work as a cultural anthropologist, by his writing as a novelist, by his very deep historical sense, and by his interest in not just the history of the last 300-400 years, which for many parts of the world has been the history of colonialism, but even prior to that. So he says, in The Great Derangement, he says, in a substantially altered world, when sea level rise has swallowed the Sundarbans and made cities like Kolkata, New York, and Bangkok uninhabitable, when readers and museum goers turn to the art and literature of our time, will they not look, first and most urgently, for traces and portents of the altered world of their inheritance? And when they fail to find them, what can they do, other than to conclude that ours was a time when most forms of art and literature were drawn into the modes of concealment that prevented people from recognizing the realities of their plight? Quite possibly then, this era, which so congratulates itself on its self-awareness, will come to be known as the time of the Great Derangement. Right, that's the title of the book. And so he narrates two episodes from his life, and I feel like the texture of Great Derangement is, interesting how he opens that conversation as part of where we're going. So I'm just going to read you this. He says, my ancestors were ecological refugees. long before the term was invented. They were from what is now Bangladesh, and their village was on the shore of the Padma River, one of the mightiest waterways in the land. The story, as my father told it, he says, was this. One day in the mid 1850s, the great river suddenly changed course, drowning the village. Only a few of the inhabitants had managed to escape to higher ground. It was this catastrophe that had unmoored our forebears. In its wake, they began to move westward and did not stop until the year 1856, when they settled once again on the banks of a river, the Ganges, in Bihar. I first heard the story on a nostalgic family trip as we were journeying down the Padma River in a steamboat. I was a child then, and as I looked into those swirling waters, I imagined a great storm, with coconut palms bending over backward until their fronds lashed the ground. I envisioned women and children racing through howling winds as the waters rose behind them. I thought of my ancestors sitting huddled on an outcrop, looking on as their dwellings were washed away. And if you saw the footage of the floods in Pakistan, you may have seen, similar scenes of people kind of rushing to save themselves from what was unthinkable. A third of the country was underwater when the floods came a few years ago in Pakistan. In another episode, he describes how he ducked and crouched into a building when he was at Delhi University. There's a place called Morrisnagar. And he says that he heard howling winds, and there was a funnel cloud. Right? This is very close to home. There was a funnel cloud, and he ran and ducked and had the sense to kind of put a building between him. I mean, I don't know that we have tornado shelters. So I also went to Delhi University. I am also an alum of the same university. And we had never heard of tornadoes in New Delhi. So you have cyclones hitting the southern part of India, the peninsula that goes into the ocean. But you don't have tornadoes up north, in the landlocked north. And so, someone like Ghosh, who is a writer, thinks about these things, about the kind of disorientation that happens when something like a tornado comes in. And his main point in giving us these two examples is to say that later on in life, he was prepared by these episodes to be a witness to climate change. Right? And so to me, it's interesting that there has been maybe a refusal, at least in fiction, in writing, I think also in culture and society, to really witness the fact that climate change is happening. And he also connects culture and climate in interesting ways, where he says that our love of, let's say, and this is all from The Great Derangement, I'm kind of translating some of what he's saying, that our love of cars, appliances, certain kinds of homes, builds up in us, or builds up the value of certain things that we then want, that we desire, through its association with film stars, or with wealth, or with luxury, creating an image of life, he says, that is full of unexpected delights. So he's talking about an advertisement that links a tropical island to a world paradise. And he says this idea goes way back to Daniel Defoe and people like Rousseau, where the ideal life is supposed to be on an island. And of course, nowadays a flight will, transport us to an island, and it's our great escape from our life to another place. Or when you see a green lawn that has been watered, he says, with desalinated water in Abu Dhabi or Southern California or some other environment, where people had once been content to just live among shrubs and use water really thriftily, we know that some desire for those green lawns has been transported to completely different landscapes where, there's no kind of alignment of your desire with what that particular place and its climate allows you. And part of what he's saying is that these desires are created by culture and also as reflected in fiction. So the tea parties of Jane Austen, the idea of beautiful green lawns that we get from English novels, right? The Emerald Isle, as Shakespeare called it. And none of this pays any attention to what he calls the extraction of materials and resources from different parts of the world that makes this possible. Why were there cashmere shawls in Victorian times in London? Cashmere is not grown in London or found there. Or sugar or tea, right? All of these were imports that became signs of, a luxurious life. So he looks at sort of the great, duration of history. And I think part of what he's saying is, if fiction does create these desires in us, and I really like that idea, which other people have also commented on, because it gives the written word and literature a power in our lives that we rarely pay attention to, right? That novels create ideas of romance and love, which in some sense came from the 19th century novel, by which my students always say, what do you mean there was no love 500 years ago? And I'm like, no, it's how you understand it, how you enact it, how the rituals around love, all of that was created by our reading of fiction. So when he says this, he means then, I think, to go to a place where he's saying, well, what is fiction doing about now? What is fiction then doing about what is happening in the world at this point of time? And so he says, when the subject of climate change occurs in these publications, it is almost always in relation to nonfiction. Novels and short stories are rarely to be glimpsed in this horizon. And it's not what he would call, so you have extraterrestrial stuff happening, interplanetary travel, you have science fiction will definitely look at worlds beyond ours. But the novel doesn't do that. We still turn again and again to Jane Austen. We still turn again and again to Dickens. So what's happening to or even Virginia Woolf, what's happening to the contemporary novel? And he gives the example, he's widely read, of someone like Paul Kingsnorth, who he says has devoted so many years to climate activism. He's a writer. He wrote a powerful nonfiction account of global resistance to climate change, but he has not yet written a novel about climate change. So he's, looking at this phenomenon. In his own practice, Ghosh says later on that he hasn't been able to necessarily write a novel until very recently. So then I want to just talk a little bit about, realism. How do we understand realism? Because I think what we're talking about is the realist novel to which we all always turn for our satisfactions of fiction. And it's a notion that character is kind of at the nexus of many social forces. It's a notion that, and we do use the 19th century as a model, right? So whether you have Balzac or Tolstoy or Dickens or George Eliot or Flaubert in the French context, and that there is some kind of set of ideas, which we would call ideology, that determines the world of the novel. So realism isn't real for us English folks. This is always really disorienting for students. It's like, what do you mean? Realism isn't real because it's like a model that you make of a world. And just as a model would not be confused with the reality, neither is fiction. But it does need to pull you in enough to say that it is giving you a combination of things that approximate to what could be real. So characters that are credible, right? Action that could happen, but of course it hasn't happened like that in the world. I always ask people, they read Jane Eyre, and it's a great romance, and it's one of the, actually not many of my students read Jane Eyre, sadly, but but it is a great love story of the 19th century, but it's much more than that. And I asked them, how many governesses married their employers? 0.000, I can't even go there. Minuscule, right? So to say that that's real is very questionable. So realism does incorporate the making of worlds, the fantasy of worlds. I studied with Harry Shaw, who is a great scholar of realism, and he works largely on Walter Scott. And he says that realism, and he's of course, realism went into sort of disfavor, as many of you may know, though now I think it's come back hugely. But with the coming of people like Henry James, Virginia Woolf, in the English context, it was modernism that we were more kind of enamored with. But Harry Shaw says realism is actually more complicated, that it invites us to look at the everyday and the commonplace, right? So things like, why does a chair look the way it looks? Or the shawl, where does the shawl come from? And my favorite thing to say about realism is that it really makes things in fiction important. Things such as, why is a lady wearing an emerald necklace? Immediately in the novel, you want to know, where did it come from? Is she rich? Was it gifted? Is it from a lover? Is it from a father, right? So things acquire a social life. And when things acquire a social life in the world, then we pay attention to them, but they have been planted there by the writer. There's nothing natural about someone appearing in a certain book and falling in love with somebody or wearing an emerald necklace. So it's the kind of artifice of it that is made to look like a model of society that we call realism. And so what is being insisted on, according to Harry Shaw, is that certain aspects of external reality matter. That's up to the writer to say what matters. To Dickens, it was looking at London through the eyes of a child, right? Looking at industrial London through the eyes of a child. In every novel, there's that child, whether it's Pip or it's David. So you make those particular aspects matter, and that's, I was talking about ideology, that's where ideology comes in. That is an idea of the world. Who's going to be the good guy in your story? Who's going to be the villain? That is a choice you as a writer make, and when you do that, you're communicating your sense of the world. Why are all the rich people bad guys, or most of them, unless they're benevolent, in Dickens's novels? Why does he do that, right? Because he is interested in the fate of those who are poor in industrial England, and he presents them with a great deal of sympathy, even though most of us get attached to the fact that ultimately David becomes a writer, at the end. That's the success story part, but a lot more goes on in his novels, where you see people's homes, you see the homes of poor people, you go into different parts of London that, you wouldn't otherwise, and so on and so forth. So just like, very kind of simple definition that I kind of grabbed from writers on it. So normally when we say realism, it's a period in literary history, a specific tradition of writing in the 19th century, and then, as I said, prominently associated with people like Balzac, George Eliot, Flaubert, and Trollope, and I would, of course, add, I think Dickens, people leave out. Why? Because even there, though he's supposed to be a realist, he's really bizarre. Right? He has characters who are crazy. And he has events happen that are completely crazy, And so I think people want, but then you start doing that with any of these writers, and you could take them out of realism, because I think we have this idea that realism is flat, and it's not, right? It's extremely complicated. The second thing is there are a set of aesthetic conventions, a complex and psychologically credible characters, a coherent and causally linked plot, and everyday settings. So unlike, let's say, an epic or a road novel where it's episodic, one thing happens in one city, then nothing happens in another place, then something happens elsewhere. Then Odysseus finds Circe, then he finds Cyclops, then somehow he gets back to Ithaca. None of those things are linked, right? He doesn't have to. It's not Circe who leads him to the next part of the plot and the next part. They're just all episodes. In a novel, you do have to link them. There has to be some sense of causality. And I feel like there, again, ideology comes into play. Why will you cause a rich person to do something bad to a poor person? That's ideology right there. Or, alternatively, a poor person to do something to a rich person, as Arvind Adiga does in his White Tiger, where, the servant kills the master. Here I'm talking through my hat because I couldn't bring myself to read the novel. But I know it happens. It just seems so ghastly that So I have some sense of yet another aspect of realism, which is, give me some characters I can like. So realism does traffic in what we call idealism, right? The idealism by which you create characters who either seem everyday or at least seem likable, have an interior life. They love, they hate, You don't really know with Odysseus what's going on inside his. I mean, maybe now and then when he goes and fights suitors for his wife, well, maybe he likes his wife, but you don't know that from, reading the Odyssey, right? So this idea of the interior life, a psychological life, is also a development of the novel. Here again, my students will say, what do you mean? People had no psychology 500 years ago? It's like, no, it wasn't written up in these ways. We have no way of accessing it. You're just guessing unless you have a time machine, right? So I'm, in some sense, committed to what we got in writing. And that's the novel through the last 200-300 years. So that's sort of realism. So then I move to, the next part, which is, so Ghosh is trying to diagnose, going back to Ghosh, why the novel did not engage with climate change. And he says that the relative stability and regularity of the age before ours meant that everything became very quiet. And the great age of realism, he says, relegated anything dramatic or catastrophic to the background. And your focus became on everyday life. Things like who meets whom, who gets invited to tea, who loves, who gets a wedding, and so forth. And the great age before us, I'm sure that there are scholars of biology here, so please don't hold me to describing to you what our great age is. I think it's called the Holocene. What we're talking about now is the Anthropocene, which is when human action on the climate has triggered a new age, and we call it the Anthropocene, hence also the title. And some people date it to 1950, right? That we've acted on the climate enough, or acted on the planet enough, that we've triggered a new age. So the Holocene was calm, according to Ghosh. So you had these novels of everyday life. And then he quotes from the great French novelist Flaubert's great novel, Madame Bovary, where she says at one point, she detests commonplace heroes and moderate sentiments such as there are in nature. To which Ghosh responds, commonplace? Moderate? How did nature ever come to be associated with words like that? And then he goes on to explain that part of it is, shows us that these were the assumptions of an earlier time, and the Anthropocene has already disrupted this, right? Because that whole idea of stability, that nature is calm and boring. Art is dramatic and kind of, exciting. It has exciting events. Nature is calm. You can look at a landscape. Landscape isn't going to do much. And Ghosh says, okay, that was in the before days, people, right? The Anthropocene is here now. And from the reverse perspective of our time, the complacency and the confidence of the emergent bourgeois order, he says, seems to be another of those instances where he says the planet seems to be toying with humanity, because we couldn't know what's going to happen now in the 21st century. Explaining this further, he says, things like quiet, beautiful landscapes, everyday descriptions of home, no supernatural or magical, as I said, unless you're Dickens, where he just throws these things into his work. They dominated the realist novel. And we have come to expect that when we go to see a realist film or read a realist novel. You don't really expect that something insane is going to happen, right, in this. So Ghosh makes 3 points. He says, unlike epics, novels don't usually bring multiple universes into conjunction. There's one consolidated universe where things act upon each other and they cause each other, and that's how you go through. Now, of course, if you think about someone like Trollope, he's got the Napoleonic Wars happening, and then suddenly you come back to London. But the characters who were fighting in the war come back to London. They're the connector, right? It's their experience, and then they come back to homes, and then they fall in love, and then they talk about war. There's something that's connecting those worlds. It's not episodic. So he says, and he gives us 2 examples, the Ithaca of the Odyssey, which I think we are familiar with, but also the Ayodhya of the Ramayana, which is an Indian epic. Many of you may know about Ramayana, where also, Ram goes from place to place, kind of doing heroic deeds, but there isn't kind of a logic of causality there. Novels also, he says, don't necessarily spend long durations of time, unlike the epic, where you have like 20, 30, 40 years of war going on. Right? In a novel, you have to resolve the action within a generation, maybe 2, maybe 3. You're thinking about your grandfather. But there is some kind of what we call unity of time, but not in the Aristotelian sense, where everything has to happen in this room. So you've moved away from that, but you are linking it somehow, he says. He says, so novelists have bounded worlds, and a novelist traces connections and interconnections within them. So there is a sense of finitude in these words, right? Of finitude. Ghosh believes that the need for fictions that are able to communicate uncanniness, improbability, magnitude, interconnectedness of the transformations, that we need to have fiction that can do that, sort of expand the universe away from perhaps what we call the domestic, psychologistic, or make connections between them. Ultimately, Ghosh proposes that to think with the Anthropocene, we have to think beyond language and what is human. And we have to start reading nature, just in the way that we analyze a bird call. Or when he says, he takes this example that, there's a cow that comes to eat grass and it's your pasture, and what do? You say shoo. Okay, what does a cow know what shoo is? Right? It's like you're trying to communicate with the cow. You're standing there with your arms and you're saying shoo. There is obviously a need to communicate with another being. So he says, and I was thinking also of this novel that came out, I'm not sure, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, called Overstory, Richard Powers, where trees become the protagonists, and human beings are really they shrink in the world of the universe. And trees speak to each other, they communicate, they have a life, they have process. And Ghosh thinks that such modes of perception, here's where he gets me, because I'm just trying to think, such modes of perception really did exist in ancient stories, such as in animal fables, right? And in certain other modes of representation that somehow were displaced by realism. So now we come to how has fiction dealt with these disruptions? So Ghosh is saying, okay, nothing has been done, and I thought that the best way to tackle him was to show him that he actually did write 2 novels, I mean, he'll acknowledge that now, that have taken up climate change. And the first one is The Hungry Tide, the second one is called Gun Island. And Hungry Tide was published in 2004, and it's set in the islands and estuaries of the Sundarbans Delta in West Bengal in India. And it is, in the novel, he's concerned with the extinction of species, the conflict between the human and the animal, also with post-colonial governments and their kind of criminal acts, right, where a whole bunch of people are just shot because you have to clear the delta. Why do you have to clear the delta? Because it's the greatest reserve in the world of the tiger. And it's important, when we think of animal conservation, we don't always think of the human costs of it as well. Animal conservation is a great thing, but it's actually being done in very conflictual spaces in the global south. So the protagonist is Pia, who is a Bengali American. She's grown up in the United States. She's a marine biologist, and she decides to go and do a research project in the Sundarbans Delta. And here's what it looks like. As you can see, it covers India and Bangladesh, right? So there's the national boundary there, but the Sundarbans Delta covers both. And what happens here is that people who are fisher folk, obviously there's no line in the water. Nations think that these boundaries are hard and fast. People who live along borders are used to thinking of that land as theirs, or those waters as it's even harder to draw a line in the water. So what happens is that fisher folk are often on all these islands. They're very nomadic. They try to make a livelihood on those islands, and they are kind of amazing because, as I'll show you in this slide, they're kind of estuaries, and the water goes in many, many miles and creates these estuaries. So that is fresh water that you see as a river, and when it comes into the Bay of Bengal, it's salt water. So it's this conjunction, it creates a unique kind of ecosystem there. And here is where the tiger lives. Here also is where Pia is going to do research. So it's kind of an exciting novel in that sense. She goes there and has many encounters with representatives of the Indian government. I'll leave you to guess, all bad. And then she finds a fisherman who doesn't speak her language because she speaks no Bengali, and he saves her from having fallen in the water with a face in the, in the mud. He rescues her, and they establish a kind of symbiotic relationship on his boat. When he understands, she gives him flashcards, she's trying to tell him, I'm looking for the dolphins, and because he knows where the dolphins are, the story is that then together they navigate and find the dolphins. Meanwhile, there's lots happening with the tiger. Tiger kills people. Ghosh is interested in what kind of culture is in this area, and it's described as agricultural land, mud flats, tidal sandbars, swamps, islands, estuaries, and it's so marvelous that in the space of a day, islands disappear, and then they reemerge elsewhere. So it is magical in its kind of natural way. So Ghosh is exploring the tensions between the tiger, nomadic fishermen, and relying on the research done by a young anthropologist, Anu Jales, on the Sundarbans. He also discusses the amazing amalgam of Persian, Arabic, Urdu, Bengali, and a few other languages in the area, because he says, it's all the way on the eastern part of India. How did all these languages get there? It's nowhere near Persia or the Middle East, right? So what it does is it shows him these massive trading networks that predate the coming of the British, predate the coming of the Dutch, predate the coming of the Portuguese. And absolutely, they were vital and commercially successful and vibrant worlds of commerce and life that existed, although the British would have us believe they only started when they came. So in the book, he explores the legend of Bon Bibi, who is a goddess or a presiding deity of a forest. And what's interesting is Bon Bibi is worshipped by Muslim fishermen. The idea of a goddess actually comes from Hinduism. Right? So he's confused, and it's because all these things have merged in the Sundarbans, and it's so for him it's this great kind of syncretic kind of combination of Islamic, Hindu, and other regional and religious practices. And I'll probably just conclude with talking a little bit about this novel, and I know that we're going towards a break. So the ocean and the estuaries are at the heart of this novel. But there is, there's just so much in the novel. I'm just going to go towards the conclusion where there's a catastrophic scene of the flood. And I feel like in 2004, Ghosh is yet to build towards something that makes sense. That idea of a plan that I talked about in the novel. These things are happening at the same time. It's not clear that they are causing each other. They just sort of exist there. And so he makes I think his achievement is to make of natural forces a real presence in the novel. At the end, there's a scene of a flood in which Fakir the fisherman and Pia, they build a friendship, and then they're caught. A cyclone hits Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is often hit by cyclones. And they're in a tree where Fakir takes a loose piece of cloth, an old sari, and he ties them both to the tree, and ultimately a tree branch breaks and kills Fakir, and Pia is saved. Right, and she reappears in a later novel of his. So it's an astonishingly sort of tragic ending that way. And I just want to read you the end. And then it was as if a dam had broken over their heads. The weight of the rushing water bent the tree trunk almost double. Encircled in Fakir's arm, Pia felt herself being tipped over and then upended as the branch met the ground. All the while the water raged around them, circling furiously, pulling at their bodies, as if it seemed that at any moment it would be torn from the earth and added to the storm of turbulence following the wave. So, Debjani Ganguly, a scholar, says, what happens when we are forced to confront futuristic, post-apocalyptic scenarios in the present? And is this distinction between realist and speculative fiction at that point dissolving, or is the novel going to do something new? And she thinks that Ghosh, what he's doing is he's recalibrating human habitation on the planet so that so many other actors become part of the action. And it's in a way the novel is now including mythological, historical, planetary, geological, and also, everyday social reality, right? And that I think is the achievement of many of these. I wanted to just show you, so you get a visual, and maybe then we can stop there, of the tiger. So some of this is disturbing, but it's disturbing because people in the global south make their living this way, if I can get this to work.
In the Sundarbans mangrove forest east of Calcutta in India, the confrontation between man and beast has existed since ancient times. Yet the animal seems to hold the advantage in this inhospitable environment. Here, the tiger imposes his law. Even when they're fishing for otter, the men never forget the dreadful danger it represents. They don't feel safe, even in the middle of the river. They know that a tiger can easily swim at night to devour the occupants of a boat.
That's Bone Baby.
Banabibi, the goddess of the forest, chose this beast as her steed for its strength and extraordinary agility. In India, the tiger is a protected species. But when one of them has killed too many people, the authorities decide, regretfully, to eliminate it. The remains of the Lord are put on display, accompanied by an enormous outpouring of popular fervor. Everyone touches it, hoping to absorb some of its strength and its supernatural powers. The tiger is extremely important in the imagination of this people. Many dances and events are held in its honor. In the Sundarbans, this big cat reigns supreme over its realm. The men have only a single recourse to escape its attacks, pray to the goddess Banabibi, whose story is told in every village. Banabibi, a Muslim princess raised by the wild animals of the forest, became the mother goddess of all the creatures in the region, which was not to the liking of the Hindu god Daksin Ray, who had been the undisputed master of the forest up to then. He sent his mother to fight Banabibi, but the princess won instead. Since then, the goddess has the power to save any creature in the forest from the claws of the fearsome Daksin Ray, incarnated as a tiger. Today, the men are preparing to enter the forest to gather honey. They are organizing a puja, a ceremony for the gods of the forest. Prayer is their only refuge, their only protection against the dangerous predator.
Okay, I'm going to just stop there because I know it's a lovely piece on this. But all I want to say here is that when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about the novel in which he thinks, and perhaps rightly, we can debate that, he does come up with a form that shows climate change. And so I'm just going to talk about that later, I think we.
And we'll have a 10-minute break. And now, once again, Professor Kapila.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I paused to say that Hungry Tide doesn't quite get everything right about how to show climate change as inherent in the world that he is describing. And I just wanted to give you a quick example of how scholars have looked at these catastrophic events. We stopped at the moment of the flood, which also concludes the novel. And a scholar called Ursula Kluwig says, it's very odd to have a flood in a realist novel. And she talks about George Eliot's Mill on the Floss, which many of you may have read, 1860. The action of the novel concludes with, and I remember when I read it, I had this vague memory when I first read Mill on the Floss. I was so upset with George Eliot because just when you think things are going to be okay, brother and sister, resolve their differences, as I always want some kind of happy ending. There's a flood and it drowns the two of them, right? Tom and Maggie Tulliver, if you remember. And many people say that she wrote this excellent novel, but then there's some bad faith in when you contrast the flood with the authenticity of everything that comes before. Authenticity is just like a big no-no when we talk about realism, but this is sort of what scholars early on said. Another scholar said that although the ending is brilliantly done, he calls it a surrender. Like, what do I do now? Okay, let's have a flood and just end it. And he says the novel resorts to these devices of the fable, right? Choosing a contrived way out of an irresolvable crisis. So we're back to this idea that any cataclysmic event in a novel is to be looked on with suspicion. Well, it turns out another scholar went and did some research and found that George Eliot went and looked at the local, the local records about rivers. She traveled with her partner to find a river that had flooded. She read about its history, about the kind of geology of rivers, and she finally decided to place it where she does in the novel. So given that, here I'm making the opposite argument, given that George Eliot herself actually really did mean flood in the river, why have readers then said this is a cop-out? Because she did lots of research on it. That means our expectations as readers are also that these things don't happen in a novel. And another scholar says, instead of reading it as a fable or something that was just tacked on, or, okay, you need a conclusion, let's have a flood, why not read it seriously for what it is? That is, it's a flood is a flood is a flood. And that why not think about the fact that floods change people's lives over generations. Often they happen because of either overbuilding, or they happen because of economic downturns, or because agricultural practices force people to do something or the other, or because of erosion. And so look at the sort of real reasons why you might have floods. So I think that's interesting, because now we're moving from what writers do to what readers expect. So then I want to move to Ghosh's Gun Island, which was published in 2019, so much more recent, in which he has written The Great Derangement in 2016, and then he comes to this, because this is clearly on his mind. And here he presents, for the first time, a global scale of events. So not just the Sundarbans is part of it, but the action of this novel, sort of amazing. It takes place in Venice, the Mediterranean. The protagonist starts as a librarian in a Midwestern university, and leaves then to go back to his home in Kolkata, is friends with a woman who is a scholar from Venice, who visits him there. Lots of stuff is happening. And on the way, when he goes for a conference to Los Angeles, he finds wildfires. He goes to Venice and the Mediterranean. There are a boatload of climate refugees that arrive there. So his name is Dean, and Dean is kind of, the narrator and the protagonist of this novel. So he makes friends with Cinta, who is the older scholar who lives in Venice, Italian. And there are two parts to the novel, the two kind of streams of action. One happened in the 17th century, where Dean is thinking about the movements of a merchant, and that is the merchant who finds himself on an island called Gun Island. That's where the title comes from. And there's a legend that says, Banduki Saudagar, or gun merchant, that's what you would say in Bengali or Hindustani. The gun merchant goes on a historical journey to the Mediterranean and the Middle East to escape the wrath of a goddess, the goddess of snakes, called Mansa Devi. Mansa Devi is a story that Ghosh had heard in his childhood. She's the subject of many shrines, folk songs, theater of the kind I showed you earlier about the tiger. There's similar similar kind of literature and performances around Mansa Devi. And in most parts of India, you will find a temple. If you look, you'll find a temple to Mansa Devi. And so people encounter it in multiple ways as they're growing up. The protagonist, Dean, who's an avowed rationalist, struggles to respect these beliefs. He's like, oh, these are just stories, And the story goes that the gun merchant refuses to become a devotee of Mansa Devi. And then I'm quoting, plagued by droughts, famines, storms, and other calamities, he had fled overseas to escape the goddess's wrath, finally taking refuge in a land where there are no serpents, a place called Gun Island. But even there, he's not safe from the goddess, who first warns him that she had eyes everywhere. And then he hides in an iron-walled room, and a tiny poisonous creature creeps through a crack and bites him. Barely surviving the bite, the merchant escapes. He's captured by pirates. He's made a prisoner. He's about to be sold. The goddess appears to him and says, if you become my devotee and build a shrine to me, I will free you. So then he sees the light of day. He says, okay, I'll do that. And this is the shrine that Dean sees on a visit to the Sundarbans, an actual temple to the goddess Mansa Devi. And here's this legend. So up to this point, the goddess seems like a vindictive and angry creature. And certainly gods and goddesses can be that. But Dean is thinking about the goddess, and he says, but the Mansa Devi of the legend was by no means a goddess in this sense. Snakes were not so much her subjects as her constituents. To get them to do her bidding, she had to plead, cajole, persuade. She was in fact a negotiator, a translator, or better still, a portavoce, as the Italians say, a voice carrier between two species that had no language in common and no shared means of communication. Without her mediation, there would be no relationship between the animal and the human. So he turns the legend to say she's not so much punishing him as pleading that if you stop communicating with me and I am the mediator, there's going to be a catastrophe. So she becomes a sort of an intermediary in the story. Okay, Chinta goes to Calcutta, and there's a kind of performance of Mansa Devi happening there, and Dean is like, oh, you don't want to see this. You big scholar of folklore from Venice, yes, but this is just what common people do. And she says, how did you get to be this way about your own culture? And she goes in there and she sees this is what is pretty much, you could say, it's kind of operatic. It's more like an opera about Mansa Devi. But then the second part of the action happens in Venice, where because of Chinta's good, recommendations, he finds work. And he finds in Venice a community of Bengalis speaking the language with a particular dialect. And I'll leave you to guess where they come from. They come from the Sundarbans. Of these, there are two young boys who he met when he visited that temple of Mansa Devi I told you about. And their names are Tipu and Rafi. So these climate migrants, because there's no work in the Sundarbans. Once the islands start disappearing, the Indian government's shooting people, they're getting kind of constantly, border guards are capturing them and saying, what are you doing here? Well, I'm fishing, like my grandfather did, right? So as Chinta and Dean sit by the water, she shows him the warming waters of the lagoon, and there's a scene where she pokes at the wood and these worms come out. And she says these worms are eating the wooden structures that hold up the piers and the docks in Venice, just as the burrowing of crabs eats away the embankments in the Sundarbans. He goes back to his apartment and he finds a spider there that turns out to have come from the southeastern states of the US. It's like, what? Venice? Spider? So these creatures are appearing where they shouldn't be in the novel. Now you could call it magical. You could also call it climate change, right? In the midst of noticing these displacements, Ghosh learns that Tipu and Rafi have escaped from the Sundarbans, arrived in Turkey illegally, and then Rafi manages to escape. That's how Dean runs into him, but that Tipu is still trapped. So there's this very dramatic scene where he goes to visit the temple in the Sundarbans. Tipu goes with him. Tipu's sort of a smart aleck. He's kind of offensive. He calls him, what does he call him? He calls him old man. He calls him some other things that in his own language that are very, and Dean is kind of offended by this. Anyway, they go to the temple and a cobra comes out and bites Tipu. And then they have to rush him to the hospital and get an anti-venom that is being flown there. Very melodramatic. It's not the realist novel in some sense, if you can. So meanwhile, what happens, and I'm just coming to the sort of conclusion of the novel, Tipu leaves Libya to head to Venice on a boat. And when the the kind of climax of the novel happens, dolphins, whales, and other sea creatures help the boat and impede military authorities who would stop it from arriving in Venice. The good Navy admiral gives permission for the boat to arrive. Dean, Chinta, the workers in an NGO, human rights activists, Pia, the marine biologist from Hungry Tide, all wait to greet the boat. We see the water start to glow green, and Pia says that is bioluminescence. She is, again, also a rationalist who wants to explain it in biological terms. So every event is explained in both rational and supernatural and magical terms. So there's this massive convergence of water, sea creatures, weather also happens. Exactly the kind that you saw last night. They're, kind of twisters in the air, lightning, thunder, and this boat is heading towards Venice. So readers can be forgiven for thinking at this point that they have been set adrift on a tsunami of, impossible events. In her essay, Kluwik says, the novel presents this as a spiritual event, a halo of birds, a chakra of dolphins and whales, orbit around an Ethiopian woman on the boat, who, as the novel suggests, is a kind of miracle, an incarnation perhaps of Manasa Devi, the snake goddess, who also represents Mother Earth. And so she says, in using the flood as a connector, the novel continues a technique begun much earlier. Various natural catastrophes, as related to climate change, are linked through what she calls a diluvian imagery, right? So you have words like tsunami, flood. And so it's not an actual flood, but you get the imagery of floods, as though everything is converging. And so what appear to be separate catastrophes are really different expressions of various meteorological patterns. And they link distant places, the Sundarbans, Venice, California, the United States. So this idea of the novel suddenly being able to have a planetary vision versus a local or regional one is what Ghosh is trying to do. So you can tell me if this seems really implausible. I'm still scratching my head. Like, seriously? Dolphins and others. And ultimately, of course, the refugees arrive in Venice. So here's what I meant again, to go back to the ideology, where Ghosh is linking climate refugees with climate change, right? With the displacement of other creatures, with the fact that we are ignoring certain events that affect all of us. So there is a vision, as the realist novel wants you to have, that is bringing all these events into some kind of causal connection. The spider is not accidentally there. It's there because, and those worms are there apparently because the waters of the lagoon in Venice are warming. And as I was preparing for this talk, a colleague sent me something from the New York Times that said that Venice is going to be flooding and that there is a huge fear there of what is going to happen, right? And of course, it's Venice, so it'll capture our attention because it's in Europe, but there's so many parts of the global south, island nations, that are already feeling that in the future they're not sure where they're going to be. So what he does is to link all of this together. And I just wanted to play you a little bit of this clip of Ghosh talking about it, because I think he sort of makes some sense of, why he did this. Okay. Okay, I guess we could have done without that music.
Hey everybody, welcome back. The Library of Congress National Book Festival coverage by PBS Books continues. Very proud right now to be sitting with Amitabh.
Oh, what did I just do? Where did my cursor go? Oh, here, okay. Not sure what it's very...
Ghosh, who's the author of a new novel called Gun Island. Welcome, sir. It's great to have you here.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's really great. We were talking earlier about this festival and the crowds and the knowledgeable people that are at your events. It must be kind of fun to be amongst all these readers and all these people who appreciate your work and want to learn more about it.
It was fantastic, yeah. I mean, my main event, there were so many, like kids, who'd read my stuff when they were in school.
Yeah.
They'd read essays or excerpts or something, and they were full of questions. They'd come from Alexandria. So it was really wonderful. It was moving.
That's awesome.
Honestly.
Yeah, I'm glad you're enjoying a time here. It is an amazing event.
It's an amazing
I'm
event.
constantly, I
Yes.
spend most of my day just in awe of the event they put on. It's a one day,
I
just
know.
incredible smash. It keeps going on.
It's
so.
incredible and so well organized.
I know.
You know, I mean, everything just, despite having hundreds of thousands of people here,
Yeah.
it's just so
They've
well
got it
organized.
down.
It's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Gun Island a little bit. What I was most fascinated by with Gun Island was this notion of Bengali folklore, and the fact that you've been kind of mining that for this story. There's sort of an old Bengali folk tale about the gun merchant, and you bring in this Hindu folk goddess of who is this other goddess that comes in. Can you talk a little bit about your interest in that and how you decided to sort of pull together all these elements into this really interesting new story of yours?
Well, you know, this story, I mean, the folk tale of the merchant and of the goddess of snakes, it's actually a very, very ancient tale where I'm from in Bengal. So I grew up with it, you know, I grew up listening to it, and everyone knew many different versions of this story. But you know, one of the interesting things about that story is really the conflict between the merchant and the goddess of snakes is exactly the conflict between profit and industry, if you like, and the environment. So even though this story is so old, I mean, it's an ancient story. It really conceptualizes, if you like, the basic issue at the heart of climate change. You know.
So did you know when you were like, when did you see climate change in that when you were originally thinking of this? When did it dawn on you that there was this crossover, this overlay between those two ideas?
Oh, you know, I've known this story forever, but it's only in recent times when I started rereading some of these stories that it struck me that, you know, this is what they're talking about. They see that, you know, if the human has rights, then also other beings, other creatures,
Yeah.
they have to have rights as well. Otherwise, you know, who's going to win? The whole world will be destroyed.
That's right. It's a powerful notion. This idea that because obviously we sit here in a world where human beings make all the decisions and
Yeah.
often at the sort of peril to the earth itself and to the animals around it, but that giving them that same kind of power is something that's been just anathema to this. People just can't grip that for whatever reason. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that there's so many people that still sort of create a hierarchy between living things like that?
Well, one fairly obvious reason I would say is because we no longer have stories like this. In our stories, you know, non-human things they don't have agency, they don't have a voice, they don't have any powers of communication. And actually, if you think about it, it's such a strange idea because we know now that trees, for example, have very complex forms of communication. They're not forms of communication that we can understand, but we know that they're able to communicate with each other about danger, about protecting the young, and so on. I mean, they have very complex forms of communication. We know that about, let's say, dolphins and whales, and it's probably true of many other species, you know. So, you know, in the past, human beings recognize this. They recognize that other creatures have agency, that they have certain kinds of consciousness, if you like. And it's really only in recent times that we've stopped telling these stories. And, you know, one of the results is that we don't take that world seriously anymore.
Yeah. We talk about native, like U.S. native culture,
Yeah.
and how that was such an important part of storytelling, the sort of trees and the earth.
Okay, I'm just going to stop there. Again, it's a lovely conversation, and I'm sorry I have to like stop each of these clips because there's so much more. So I have my final novelist, but I also feel like I don't have to talk about Ruth Ozeki because I think this also holds together as a complete whole, and it would give us some time for questions, for discussion, and you know, Ruth Ozeki is making a similar point in the Pacific, and she's talking about the British Columbia and Japan, and the kind of thing that floats on the ocean towards her, and she picks it up, and it's a lovely novel, and it's here, a tale for the time being, that I some of you may want to read. But I think the point is kind of made, and so I would like to pause and take your questions and discussion, and thank you so much for listening. Okay, sure.
Thank you very much for a most enlightening talk. I have been bothered by things connected with my reading about climate change. And the first, I'm going to say, is a connection between weather events and climate. But it doesn't stop there. There are other necessary connections before we get to climate change. So if it's climate that the weather is showing, then we have to conflate that to climate change. Then we have to conflate that to human-caused climate change.
Yeah.
There are a lot of connections there that most writers pay no attention to. And as an illustration of this, my brother, who's lived in California for 50 years, has informed me that in 1860, long before the Anthropocene era, Leland Stanford, who was elected governor of California, went to his inauguration in Sacramento and had to do it by boat. The reason was that the Central Valley was flooded with about 10 feet of water, the whole Central Valley of California. So we've heard a lot about climate change and its relationship to what's happened in California. First it was the drought, and that was due to climate change, and now the recent deluge of water, and that too is due to climate change. These connections evade me.
Thank you for that question. So, if you mean that these events are really discrete and separate, then the connections between them are being made by climatologists, and I'm not doing research on those, but I have reason to believe that the frequency and the spread of those is now something we should be attending to. And then, as I started, Ghosh talks about the tornado, and he talks about the fact that his own ancestors faced it. So you could say, well, this happens from time to time. Or it's happening more frequently, and there is a reason. And the reason seems to me to be a combination of the carbon emissions, the warming of the planet, the warming of waters, the rising of waters, and that there is a connection between them that is scientific, and that human action has, that's my starting premise, rather than my area of research. I don't know, there may be other people who can speak to how we understand climate change. But I see the discrete weather events and their frequency and widespread nature as evidence of something larger happening. So, any other? Thanks, Judy.
Is that better? Ooh, hello. First, thank you for everything you had to say. It was very enlightening. It seems to me that one of the things we need to do in order to address climate change with some intelligence and wisdom is, first and foremost, we have to feel like we are a part of nature. And it seems like for so much of our history, we've felt separated from it. We need to get back to that, maybe a little bit more. Since this is an address having to do with literature, I would like to mention something about our own American tradition of literature, which stresses nature as this force for not only destruction but transformation, and how maybe if, I don't know how what kind of background people have here, but I was weaned on an American literary tradition that does stress nature. And I grew up here in Grinnell, went through the public school system, and got this from just the classes that we had. It's kind of weaned on it. Thank you, Jack Markham, wherever you are. But we just have tons of examples. Mark Twain and the Mississippi River as a force. Ole Rovog and the American tallgrass prairie, of which we are a part of, as a force. Herman Melville as a whale, and the Atlantic Ocean as a force. And finally, Zora Neale Hurston. I don't know if anybody has read Their Eyes Are Watching God, but she is tremendous, tremendous writer. She uses the hurricane as a force. All of these writers are using nature as a force, as a character in all of their writings. And just pick up any Jack London and the Yukon. It's just replete with examples. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think I have, some of that literature is familiar to me, but just picking up on something like Moby Dick, I would say it's there, but it's also, first of all, there's this big kind of debate, and I don't think Jack London would be part of it, but big debate between realism and what's called romance, the American romance, which is more about adventure. But also I think, I don't know, how would you read Moby Dick? It seems to me it's the hunting of the whale, right? And it is the whaling industry which basically destroyed whales in large parts of, and then it went to the South Pacific, where also it destroyed whales. I was just reading about that recently. So that was all part of extraction, I think Kosh would say. And so nature is present, but I kind of want to think a little bit more about how it's present and what human beings are doing with it. And I think that there are great tales of the wilderness in the United States and in the Americas that would be great. I mean, I think Native Americans have wonderful stories about living with nature. So there are those traditions. And I think that, Ghosh would agree that they're there, but are they necessarily talking about the sort of catastrophic events that he feels human beings need to pay attention to? I mean, it seems as though all's well with the world in a lot of fiction. And he's saying, what if all's not well with the world? How do we bring that into the novel? Oh, yeah, please.
The situation happens, especially with Ahab, is that he thinks he's bigger than nature. The ego gets in the way.
Yeah.
It happens in Their Eyes Are Watching God with the character
Yeah.
TK. He thinks he's bigger than the hurricane.
Yeah.
This is what we can learn from these
Yeah.
novels. Mark Twain, now in Life in the Mississippi, that's not fiction. He's the same way. He's a steamboat pilot. He needs to learn the river
Yeah.
backwards and forwards. In other words, he becomes one with the river.
Right.
And the whole idea behind all of these books is you have to, bottom line, feel that you are a part of nature or nothing's going to happen.
Right.
And you can get that from all of these works in American fiction,
Right.
and then Mark Twain.
Right.
You can get that sense of it first. I mean, that's the bottom line. That's where we have to be. We have to know that we are an intimate part of the natural order, or nothing's going to happen unless we feel that we're a part. And in these books, again with Ahab, he thinks he's bigger than that.
Yeah.
It's the idea of and the American ego, I guess, which can get out of hand, and what happens when it gets out of hand in relation to nature around us, in relation to who we are too.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the talk. You bring to mind, though, my approach to lots of things is historical. So it seems to me that we are the first generation in history that has ever lived with the concepts of taking seriously that the world is not limitless. That when the first settlers came to Iowa, they saw nothing but space.
Yeah.
We saw the oceans as being so huge that nothing we could do would impact them. And now we are beginning to see, and I think novels are a great way of doing this, of anticipating what the world would look like if we continue to look at the world as if it is limitless. And we are that generation that also has seen the first extra earthly visitation. And it's only the moon, which is only 250,000 miles away, but, you know, it's just, we are learning that through literature a lot.
Thank you. That's a wonderful comment. Yeah, and we have the next generation to think of, right? Is what we're kind of handing down to them, is a sense of a much more bounded and limited world, as you said.
One of the things I'm thinking about is that novels have, as the speaker back there noted, recognized nature as important to the, even just within the novel, right? I mean, nature is the test of human character. Nature demands a certain kind of humility. And one might think, oh, well, that's a good thing. I mean, that's better than being entirely blind to it. On the other hand, I think that sort of positioning of what is human in relation to the natural, where the human becomes what's intelligible, what's controllable, what's understandable, and nature becomes this force greater than we are, ends up having a negative effect, though you might think, oh, well, at least nature has a role here. I mean, when nature is presented as something that is not under the sway of human control or human even thought, our responsibilities in relation to nature become quite different, right? It's too big for us. I mean, what can we do? We can't make it snow. We can't make it rain. And so that it's not just a relationship to nature that's important. It is, and I think the speaker said something about humility in the face of nature, and I think that's right. But I think that at the same time, too much humility ends up getting us to a place where the natural world is one thing, whereas the built world is something else entirely.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really thought-provoking. And I feel like what, Kosh is reaching for is a language that re-envisions the relationship between the human and the natural. So it's no longer man triumphs over nature in the old sense, or nature, as you said, comes as a catastrophe and destroys man. Can we find some sort of symbiotic relationship? And if so, what is the language in which we can think about it? Like, what do we think of our relationship to the tree in our backyard? I don't know, I've never thought about it. It's a tree, right? But Richard Powers would tell you that it has a life, and it has, so living with nature, with kind of respectfully at this moment. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, Ghosh in some sense has gone back to an ancient legend and repurposed it for the modern. I think that's kind of a sleight of hand that's really interesting to me. But we have to come up with our own stories and legends for now, for what we've done and what will happen going forward. And I think it's the invention of new narrative stories. I sort of love the way he says the reason it's come to this is because if we stop telling those stories? Again, the power of stories, right? Stories are something that change human behavior. And if we should know better than to think that novels are just something, you read and they have no effect on the world. So how to create in the space of fiction a vocabulary where you live respectfully with others, and others also have a life and a language, and he says even consciousness, which would be maybe even a further step to everything that philosophy has told us. Only humans have consciousness, right? Everything else is just there. And I can think of, this seems somewhat retrogressive, but I can think of, I know, Johanna, you and I might not agree about this, but sort of religious traditions, that talk about the oneness of beings, and that means all beings. Native Americans have it, but also other traditions have it. It's an ignored part of my own tradition. I was raised Hindu, where everything, every living being has a soul, and you are part of the same soul. So, that sense of respect, of ritual, of ceremony, of creating observances that recognize that the ocean is a being and the tree is a being. How do we do that in modern vocabulary? And to come back to Ghosh's novel, it's sort of successful, but I, as the reader, may not be where Ghosh is yet. I have to be schooled to understand that the legend of Mansa Devi has come alive. Even I'm having trouble with that because I'm used to reading realist novels that don't do this, right? So it's creating new habits in readers. It's creating new narratives. It's creating new language. I think like Richard Powers does. So I think that's a great comment, Johanna, and I agree that that's the work to be done. I think in a different relationship. So. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Kapila, for being here today and sharing your insight on how some novelists look at the environment and represent climate change in literature. And I think there's probably a few books that have been added to people's reading lists today. We look forward to seeing everyone April 12th and April 19th for a two-part course entitled The Renfro Story, Edith Renfro Smith and Her Deep Roots in Poweshiek County. You will learn about the amazing woman whose name will grace the new Grinnell College building in the next block. Drake Library's Monique Shore and Grinnell College's Professor Tamara Babouf will chronicle the story of Edith Renfro Smith, whose remarkable family has roots in the earliest years of Grinnell. See you next week.